hours into Bravely Default 2, and it is by far one of the most memorable JRPG experiences of my life. Now, that might sound a little extreme, but the more time I spend in it, the more I really appreciate it for what it is. While I've been playing it recently, I've been trying to think about why it so thoroughly hooked me into it, and I think on a broad strokes level, it's because it feels as though every single aspect of the game has been developed with a huge amount of love, care, and attention to detail. I was a really big fan of the first Bravely Default game on 3DS, even though I was slightly late to the party with it. My boyfriend is a big fan of Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, which Bravely Default is a spiritual successor to, but I didn't let him convince me to give Bravely Default a try until about a year, I think, after it came out. And I'm really glad I did, because that ended up being one of my favorite JRPGs of the 2010s. I devoured the game in like a week. Bravely Second, the sequel, was unfortunately not as impressive to me, but I still enjoyed my time with it. It just relied a little too much on reused assets and felt a little too familiar, as happy as I was to see the continuation of the story and characters from the first game. The main selling point of the gameplay of the series is the idea of braving and defaulting. I won't spend too much time explaining, since it's pretty easy to understand and an interesting concept, but basically, defaulting is similar to guarding in other turn-based games. You sacrifice an action in order to take less damage until your next turn, but you're also given a BP, or a brave point, for doing it. You can continue to default to gain up to 3 BP. Opposite of defaulting is braving, which lets you do multiple actions in the same turn. You can do that up to 3 times, and each additional action costs 1 BP. The trick with this is that you can also brave without earning any BP through defaulting first, and then which puts you down into negative BP. But then you have to make up for it by being locked out of however many turns you took early before you can act again. And that makes for some interesting decisions in battles where you have to decide if you want to pay that cost or take the time to earn the BP first and run the risk of dying if you need to take the extra actions on your healer character, for example. When Bravely Default 2 was announced with an entirely new cast of characters and 0 apparent references to Bravely Default and Bravely Second, the only thing I really expected was that the game would have a job system reminiscent of Final Fantasy III, 5, and 10-2. I would say 4 Heroes of Light, but I haven't played that one myself, and it's absolutely my favorite part about the game, the job system. I do want to start off by saying I'm not going to be talking about the premise of the game or specific story beats or characters specifically in this video, mostly just gameplay. Because while I love the story and characters in Bravely Default 2, it's the addicting moment-to-moment gameplay that I find the most interesting thing to talk about. That being said, there might be a general mention of something with the story here and there, and I will be showing some footage for you to look at on screen that will show locations and character job outfits from around the mid-game, but I'm going to do my best to not spoil anything specific other than 1 or 2 jobs. The very first thing that surprised me right off the bat is just how quickly the game starts you off. Bravely Default 2 definitely has an ensemble cast of characters in your party where everyone gets pretty equal focus. But Seth is the first character you meet and control, and all the information you're given immediately is that he's a sailor of a wreck that washed up on shore. And within a span of 20 minutes, you're introduced to the basic systems, have your first battle under your belt, and then not long after that, you're given your first asterisk, which unlocks your first job, which is Black Mage. This is faster than the previous games by a pretty significant amount, since I remember being stuck with all 4 characters on Freelancer, the initial job in the first Bravely Default, for a while. And the pace doesn't stop after that opening 20 or 30 minutes. The rapid influx of new jobs as you work your way through this game is the saving grace of its pacing for me. Sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 back-to-back in the span of a few hours, and all the jobs are so different that it's all I really need to infuse energy back into the game and refresh how fun it is. And that ties directly into how well implemented the jobs are as a whole. They're very, very unrestricting. Each of the 4 characters is given access to 2 jobs' full sets of abilities, as long as you've leveled them up enough to have access to them on that character. What's more, though, is that every job has 2 or 3 passives that you can unlock and then equip that are always active. And each character can equip 5 of these, and as long as they're unlocked, you don't have to have the job you originally leveled to get that passive either. So you could set 5 different passives from 5 different jobs, regardless of what your main job and sub job you have equipped for your 2 skill sets are. As you can imagine, being able to do this on every character sets up the game for a huge amount of depth and customizability. Now, going back to the original Bravely Default, especially when it came to non-boss encounters, the game had a pretty big tendency to balance itself in such a way that spamming Brave and doing your highest damaging attack over and over again would mean that nothing could stop you from a pretty early point in the game. I remember summoning magic specifically being very powerful for just mowing down trash mobs. I'm happy to say that that is absolutely not the case for Bravely Default 2. Even trash mobs and random encounters in this can pose problems, mostly because of the counter mechanic. Some enemies will counter specific types of actions, so take for example these plant enemies will counter any and all physical attacks by trying to cast a bunch of debuffs on you. In this case it was Confuse, but there are other plant enemies that counter physical attacks with so many debuffs that it feels like you just got hit with bad breath in a Final Fantasy game. And that's especially deadly if you just spent a bunch of brave points to do attacks and now you're killing your party members instead of the enemy. But anyway, the best thing about the enemy's counter mechanic is the way it encourages you to switch things up. If the area you're in has a lot of enemies that counter physical attacks, you might want to switch it up to have a party of jobs that mostly deal magic damage or vice versa. And some enemies counter specific job actions too, so you always have to be on your toes. Eventually, though, I gained access to the Ranger job, which has a passive at level 6 called Counter Savvy, which lets you completely avoid any detrimental effects from enemy counter abilities, including all the damage. As you can probably guess, this ability paved the way for more fun ability adjusting when I gave it to my tank character. She was on the Shield Master job, which lets you jump in front of a party member and take an attack that would have hit them instead. So my main damage dealer would do a physical attack on an enemy that counters physical attacks, but my Shield Master with Counter Savvy would jump in front of her and take it instead, and since she had Counter Savvy, there would be no damage and 0 debuffs as a result, making my main damage dealer able to spam her attacks without any penalty. And that's just one notable example of what you can do because the battle system is so flexible. And I don't think you can talk about this game's battle system without bringing up its difficulty. When the first demo came out on Switch in March of last year, a lot of people talked about how the game was a little overtuned, and although I didn't play that demo despite installing it, I believe it even after playing the final game, which was altered and balanced differently. Some encounters in this game have absolutely kicked my ass, including some of the random encounters, but especially the bosses. I'm on normal difficulty, and only after around 30 hours did I start to finally feel really powerful because of my job combinations and the fact that I didn't skip any battles that were at my current level, so I was able to level up and get a lot of experience too. In my opinion, because I had to work so hard and play for so long to get to that point, it makes it feel even more satisfying, but I definitely understand that that's not for everybody, and thankfully the game does have difficulty options. And yes, the idea of a hard mode in Bravely Default 2 is pretty scary for me personally. Now I want to take a step away from the core exploration and battles because there's no way I could make a video about how much I love Bravely Default 2 without bringing up the card game. Bravely Default 2 has probably my favorite iteration of a card minigame out of any game I've ever played, even more than Final Fantasy VIII's Triple Triad. It's called B&D, or Bind and Divide, and it's actually pretty similar to Triple Triad, which is definitely a big point in its favor for me. You and your opponent in the game are given a board with 25 squares, and each player has 6 cards in their hand. Each card has a number of squares that it takes up when you place it on the board in different patterns on the grid, and you take turns with the AI, placing one card at a time until the board is filled up, and whoever has the most captured cards after all the cards are placed is the winner. The depth of the game comes from the fact that each card has different patterns of squares that it claims when you place it, and if a square overrides one that your opponent owns, it removes it from them, but doesn't give it to you either. If you're able to bookend enemy enemy squares with 2 of your own horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, you claim all the spaces in between for yourself. And that's not even getting into the field cards and special effects cards. I'm terrible at explaining it, but it's really easy to understand when the game shows it to you, and really satisfying to improve in. Oh, and absolutely with the fact that you place down monster cards and there are field spells. I had a lot of fun when I was streaming this game, as you can tell on the screen. B&D is set up similarly to Triple Triad 2 in that certain NPCs in towns will be available for card battles. You walk up to them, challenge them, and if you win, you get to keep their cards and use them in your decks. It works on a point system, so as you win, you rack up points specific to that NPC, and then you can exchange them for their cards. And this creates a really addictive collecting aspect too, since you can look and see all of your cards you've collected in your card binder. I enjoyed this card game so much that the first thing I did when I unlocked it is just fast travel back to all the towns I'd been to previously, and I tracked down everyone I could for their cards, and that distracted me for at least like 2 hours. It's also the first thing I do when I reach a new town too. I just immediately find who I can play cards with and then ransack them for their cards, and it's a great distraction from the main battle gameplay. There are rules similar to Triple Triad, but they're largely optional with a few exceptions and aren't forced on you in a way that they are in Final Fantasy VIII. It's more straightforward and more fun, at least for me. I doubt the market is really there for it, but I'd love like a mobile game with B&D as the main gameplay. But that's all I really have to say about the card game. It's great, and I had to mention it. But now I want to go back and to something I mentioned briefly in the beginning of this video, which is the sheer amount of effort that feels like it was put into everything. The amount of content in general is pretty impressive. There are a lot of side quests, and plenty of them are of the fetch quest variety, but those ones are really quick to finish up and never send you too much out of the way to get them done. And for every handful of those is a side quest that's fully voice acted and either extrapolates on side characters and the events of the main story or deepens the bond between the 4 party members. The dungeons are really well paced too, in my opinion. They're long enough to feel like a challenge to overcome, but not long enough to feel like a drag. Every boss battle is really different too, because it's the primary way that you get new jobs, so you get to see how the boss uses the abilities that you'll be able to use once you beat them, and I've always really enjoyed the little preview you get in the Bravely Default games that way. And speaking of running through dungeons, each section of the world map too, in between them, has a unique spin on the main overworld theme that changes either its tempo or the instruments involved to match the aesthetic of the area that you're in. For example, the snowy area will have a more wintry feel with lots of whistles and softer instrumentation to complement the chilly atmosphere as you walk through the snow, and I love that type of thing. I'm really glad they've got Revo back to do the soundtrack for Bravely Default 2. I don't mean any disrespect to Rio of Supercell, but something about Revo's compositions are just intrinsically Bravely Default to me, and the soundtrack here is phenomenal. The game looks gorgeous too, with the way it's stylized. The environments are fully 3D this time around, but the towns themselves are done in this drawn, painterly style that's gorgeous to look at. After Bravely Default being stuck on the 3DS with an 800 by 240 resolution, it's great to see the same idea executed in such a big way on the Switch. And without getting into any details, the story itself is good. There's nothing I would call groundbreaking in it, but Bravely Default's story didn't really get super crazy until it got closer to the end either, and right now it's still just as enjoyable, if not more so, than Bravely Default and Bravely Second. There's a lot of side characters that the game does a really good job of making you be interested in. And something else that's very near and dear to me is just how much it feels like a turn-based Final Fantasy game under a different name, particularly with the names of jobs and spells. My favorite being the fact that the lance-wielding jump class in Bravely Default 2 is actually called Dragoon this time around instead of Valkyrie like it was in the previous games. And there's one final note I really wanted to bring up too before I end off this video is I haven't done too much digging into how the game is being received because I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but from what I've seen, the reaction to the game seems positive, which makes me really happy. Obviously because I hope the game does well enough for another entry, but Also because Tomoya Asano, the producer of the series, said in an interview with Famitsu that, quote, "I would like to apologize regarding Bravely Second. Despite lots of expectations for Bravely Second, I feel that there were parts that did not meet the expectations of fans. Our reflections on the shortcomings has become a strong-rooted aspect of all the games our team is working on," end quote. And with that reflection, they went on to work on games like Octopath Traveler while not expecting to continue the Bravely Default series. Now we're getting into a pretty big aside here, but to me, this is incredibly reminiscent of what happened with Monolith Soft's Xenosaga series. That series had a very, very controversial second entry, and because of its performance and reception, what was originally going to be a 6-game series was forced to wrap up all of its plot threads in a third and final game instead, and it left the team in a low state of morale until the success of their next game, Xenoblade. I really wish we could have gotten to see what a fully realized Xenosaga series would have been like, but the performance and reception just wasn't there. Since the situation with Bravely Default as a series is so similar, I can't help but be hopeful that this game is appreciated for what it is, an incredibly fun turn-based JRPG that deserves to have a successful series to iterate on in the future. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care and stay safe. Bye for now.